It started so innocently, the kind of casual get-together that shouldn't have meant anything more. I invited my friend Lucas over for lunch, something we'd done countless times before. We'd been friends for years, and our bond had always felt unshakable, like an unspoken agreement that we'd always be there for each other. Elijah, my husband, was out of town for work. The house had been quiet, too quiet, and I'd been feeling the weight of the silence creeping into my thoughts. Lucas's company seemed like the perfect remedy. He was easy to talk to, always knew how to make me laugh, and his presence felt familiar in a comforting way. When he arrived, it was just as I'd expected. His wide grin as he stepped through the door instantly lightened the mood, and I felt myself relax. He brought a bottle of wine, joking that I deserved a little indulgence since Elijah was away. We settled into our usual rhythm, exchanging stories about work, life, and the random things that always seemed to make us laugh. Lucas had this effortless charm, a way of making you feel like you were the center of the universe when he was talking to you. I didn't think anything of it. It was just Lucas being Lucas, warm, attentive, and full of life. We sat at the dining table, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. The conversation flowed easily, like it always did with him. I told him about the latest drama at work, and he countered with a hilarious story about a coworker who had somehow managed to lock himself in the supply closet. We laughed until tears streamed down our faces, and for a moment, everything felt perfect, uncomplicated. But then, somewhere between clearing the plates and pouring the second glass of wine, something shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things, a lingering glance, a touch on my arm that lasted a fraction too long. I noticed the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, the way his smile seemed more intimate. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into innocent gestures. But the flicker of unease was there, buried beneath layers of denial. When we moved to the kitchen to clean up, the air between us felt different. I tried to shake it off, focusing on rinsing the dishes and wiping down the counters. Lucas stood close, too close, and I felt a strange tension building. He reached over me to grab a dish towel, his arm brushing against mine, and I felt a jolt of something I couldn't quite name, something I didn't want to name. I laughed nervously, making a joke about how clumsy we both were, but the words felt hollow, forced. Lucas didn't step away. Instead, he stayed there, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I told myself to say something, to break the moment, but I couldn't find the words. It was as if I was frozen, caught between the familiarity of our friendship and the undeniable shift that had occurred. In that moment, I felt a mix of emotions I didn't know how to process. Confusion, flattery, and a creeping sense of panic all swirled inside me. This was Lucas, my friend. This wasn't supposed to happen. But as much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't ignore the electricity in the air, the way my pulse quickened under his gaze. And as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, I realized I wasn't as in control of the situation or myself as I thought I was. As we stood there in the kitchen, the air between Lucas and me felt thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. He was my friend, my safe space, someone who had always been like a brother to me. But in that moment, everything familiar about him seemed to blur, replaced by something unfamiliar, something I wasn't prepared to face. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, rinsing a plate, wiping the counter, anything to distract myself from the growing tension. But Lucas was close, too close, and every slight movement seemed to draw him nearer. I could feel the weight of his presence, the way he seemed to be watching me with an intensity I hadn't noticed before. My heart raced, though I couldn't say whether it was from nervousness, excitement, or sheer panic. When he reached for my hand, I froze. His touch was gentle, hesitant, yet it felt like a jolt of electricity coursing through me. I wanted to pull away, to say something that would break whatever was happening, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. Instead, I just stood there, unable to move, unable to think clearly. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still. My mind screamed at me to stop him, to push him away, to do anything but let this happen. But my body betrayed me, frozen in place as if I were a spectator watching someone else's life unfold. I told myself it wasn't real, that this was some strange, fleeting moment that would pass if I just waited it out. But then his lips met mine and everything spiraled out of control. It was a kiss that was both tender and overwhelming, full of emotions I couldn't untangle. I didn't kiss him back, not really, but I didn't stop him either. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one colliding with the next. This was wrong. This was betrayal. This was not who I was. Yet I couldn't seem to pull myself out of the moment, out of the haze of confusion and emotion that had taken hold of me. Before I knew it, he had lifted me onto the kitchen table. The cold surface beneath me was a stark contrast to the heat between us, a reminder of the reality I was trying so hard to ignore. I felt like I was outside my own body, watching as something I should have stopped unfolded right in front of me. I wanted to say no, to tell him to stop, but the words never came. I was paralyzed by a mix of fear, shame, and something I didn't want to admit felt like desire. It all happened so quickly, yet every moment felt drawn out, etched into my memory in painful detail. The clatter of dishes, the creak of the table, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, it was all too vivid, too real. And then, just as quickly as it started, it was over. Lucas stepped back, his expression unreadable. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, my eyes fixed instead on the ceiling as I tried to process what had just happened. I felt sick, a wave of nausea rising in my stomach as the weight of what I'd done settled over me. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a betrayal of everything I stood for, of the man who loved me, of the life I'd built. Lucas didn't say much as he gathered his things to leave. He gave me a small smile, almost as if he thought things were fine, as if this could somehow be brushed aside like it was nothing. But for me, it wasn't nothing. It was everything. And as the door closed behind him, I was left alone in the kitchen, staring at the mess I'd made both in the room and in my life. When Lucas left, the silence in the house was deafening. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the space where he had just been, as if doing so could somehow rewind time and undo what had just happened. My legs felt weak, and my hands trembled as I leaned against the counter, trying to steady myself. A million thoughts ran through my head, each one louder and more condemning than the last. What had I done? How had I let it go this far? The guilt hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over me again and again until I could barely breathe. I thought about Elijah, the man who had trusted me, who loved me, who believed I was someone better than this. I thought about the life we'd built together, the promises we'd made, and how I had just shattered all of it in a single, reckless moment. I tried to justify it to myself, grasping at anything that would make me feel less like the villain in my own story. Maybe it wasn't entirely my fault. Lucas had made the first move, hadn't he? But the moment that thought crossed my mind, I felt disgusted with myself. Blaming him didn't change the fact that I could have stopped it. I could have said no, I could have walked away. But I didn't, and that was on me. The house, which had felt so lonely earlier, now felt suffocating. Every corner of the kitchen seemed to remind me of what had just happened. The table where it all unfolded felt like a monument to my failure, its presence looming over me as if it were judging me too. I wanted to run, to escape from the guilt and shame that clung to me, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in the aftermath of my own choices. When my phone buzzed with a message from Elijah, my heart sank. It was a simple text, just him checking in to see how I was doing and telling me he missed me. His words, so kind and genuine, only made the weight of my betrayal feel heavier. I stared at the screen, unable to respond, as tears welled up in my eyes. How could I face him after what I'd done? How could I look him in the eye and pretend that everything was okay? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I avoided Lucas's calls and ignored the texts he sent, each one a reminder of the mistake I was desperate to forget. But forgetting wasn't an option. The memory of what had happened replayed in my mind on an endless loop, each detail sharper and more painful than the last. That night, lying alone in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elijah's face, imagined what he would say if he ever found out. The thought of losing him, of destroying our marriage, was unbearable. But so was the guilt of keeping this secret from him. No matter what I did, there was no way to make it right. The damage had already been done. I thought about calling Lucas, about telling him we needed to talk, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I even say? That I regretted everything? That I never wanted to see him again? It felt too complicated, too messy, and I wasn't ready to face it. Instead, I lay there in the dark, drowning in my own thoughts, as the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. The worst part was knowing that this wasn't something I could just move past. It wasn't a fleeting mistake that could be swept under the rug. It was a betrayal that would stay with me forever, a scar on my soul that no amount of time could erase. And as the hours dragged on, I realized that this was only the beginning of the pain I had caused, not just for Elijah, but for myself as well. In the days that followed, I tried to go about life as if nothing had happened. I clung to routine like it was a lifeline, hoping that if I pretended hard enough, everything would return to normal. But no matter how much I tried to push it down, the weight of what I had done was always there, heavy and suffocating. Every moment of quiet was filled with the memory of that afternoon in the kitchen, and every interaction with Elijah became another test of my ability to hold it together. Elijah called every evening, as he always did when he was away. Hearing his voice, so full of warmth and love, made my chest tighten with guilt. He would ask about my day, tell me about his, and talk about how he couldn't wait to come home. I answered his questions with forced cheerfulness, trying to sound as normal as possible, but every word felt like a lie. I could hear the trust in his voice, the way he still believed in me, and it was unbearable. Lucas, on the other hand, wouldn't leave me alone. He texted constantly, asking if I was okay, if we could talk, if I was upset with him. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Seeing his name on my phone was enough to make my stomach churn. I didn't know what I could possibly say to him that wouldn't make things worse. I didn't even know how I felt about him anymore. Was I angry at him? Disgusted? Grateful? It was all tangled together in a mess I couldn't begin to sort out. The lies started piling up quickly. Elijah asked me why I seemed distant, and I told him I was just tired, that work had been stressful. When he asked if Lucas had been by recently, I told him no, even though the words felt like poison on my tongue. I had never been a good liar, and the effort of keeping everything hidden was draining me. But the thought of confessing was even worse. I couldn't bear the idea of seeing Elijah's face when he found out, of hearing the heartbreak in his voice as he realized the person he trusted most had betrayed him. Every time I thought about what had happened, I felt a fresh wave of shame. I replayed the moment over and over and over in my head, trying to understand how I had let it happen, where I could have stopped it. But no matter how many times I went over it, the answer was always the same: I had failed. I had made a choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. I started avoiding Lucas entirely. I didn't answer his calls, didn't respond to his messages. When he showed up at my door one afternoon, I pretended I wasn't home. I couldn't face him, couldn't deal with the reminder of what I had done. But avoiding him didn't make the guilt go away. If anything, it only made it worse. The worst part was the way it began to seep into every aspect of my life. I felt like I was walking around with a target on my back, like everyone could see the guilt etched into my face. I became irritable and withdrawn, snapping at Elijah for no reason and pulling away when he tried to comfort me. He didn't deserve it, and I hated myself for treating him that way, but I didn't know how to stop. I told myself that I would take the secret to my grave, that I would do whatever it took to protect Elijah from the truth. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The guilt was a shadow I couldn't escape, and with every passing day, it grew darker and heavier, threatening to consume me entirely. Secrets have a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly you try to hold them together. For a while, I convinced myself that I could keep what happened between Lucas and me buried forever. But deep down, I knew that was just wishful thinking. Secrets like this don't stay hidden, they fester, grow, and eventually find their way out. And mine did, in the most catastrophic way possible. Lucas must have felt the guilt too. He stopped texting and calling after a while, and I thought maybe he had moved on, that he was just as eager to put it behind us as I was. But what I didn't know was that he had told someone. He confessed to his girlfriend, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of a misguided sense of honesty. Whatever his reasons, the secret didn't stop with her. It spread like wildfire, tearing through the fragile walls I had built around my life. One evening, Elijah came home from work earlier than usual. The moment he walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. His expression was cold, distant, a stark contrast to the warm smile he usually greeted me with. He didn't say much at first, just set his bag down and looked at me in a way that made my stomach drop. Then he asked, his voice low and trembling, "Is there something you need to tell me?" My heart stopped. In that moment, I knew the truth had found its way to him. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My mind raced, trying to think of an explanation, an excuse, anything to make this less devastating than it was. But there was nothing. He didn't wait for my answer. Instead, he told me he'd heard from Lucas's girlfriend, that she had called him in tears, spilling everything. He recounted the details she shared, his voice cracking with every word. Hearing it all laid out like that from someone else's perspective was like being hit by a train. There was no denying it, no talking my way out of it. The truth was out and the damage was done. I tried to apologize, to explain, but every word sounded hollow, pathetic. How do you apologize for something so unforgivable? How do you make someone understand a moment of weakness that destroyed everything? Elijah didn't yell or lash out. He just stood there, staring at me with a look of pain and betrayal that cut deeper than any words ever could. In the days that followed, everything fell apart. Elijah couldn't bring himself to stay in the house with me, so he left, saying he needed time to think. I knew what that meant. Time to think was just a softer way of saying goodbye. I didn't blame him. How could I? I had betrayed his trust in the worst way possible. Lucas tried reaching out again after that, but I blocked his number. Whatever connection we had, whatever twisted moment had led to that day in the kitchen, was over. I didn't want to see him, hear from him, or even think about him. All I could do was try to pick up the pieces of my shattered life, though I had no idea where to start. Elijah's absence was a constant reminder of what I had lost. Every room in the house felt empty without him. Every little detail reminded me of the life we had shared. The guilt and regret were unbearable, but they were nothing compared to the pain of knowing I had hurt the one person who had always been there for me. Now I'm left with the aftermath, a life that feels hollow and broken. I know I brought this on myself and I'll carry the weight of it forever. Some mistakes you can recover from, but this was the kind of mistake that changes you, the kind that leaves scars you can never erase.